Hello there. My name is... Here, let me show you. Lapin. L-A-P-I-N. Lapin, see? And this is, Lucian. I'll help him write it since he doesn't have any bones. Lucian. L-U-C-I-A-N. Lapin Lucian. We sound pretty similar. So, we spend a lot of time here in this room. It's quite comfortable. Very soothing, very peaceful. We can get a lot of work done here, like computing, editing videos, playing games, that sort of deal. But it's a little isolating, you know. One can go a little crazy in here. Sometimes I'll be trying to sleep and Lucian will become obsessed with something, and then he won't shut up about it for hours. He'll start yammering in my ear like a fuzzy little brainworm, like, I need to tell the world, get the word out. But he's a bit shy in front of the camera, so he'll beg me to get in front of this camera and, you know, help him get the word out. And what better place to do it than the World Wide Web, here on YouTube. Even this, broadcasting our thoughts to the world, we can do it from our cozy room. So, you know, why ever leave? And so here we are, making this video to share with anyone that may stumble upon it and hopefully watch it. And we also hope you'll have fun watching it. That's the most important part, having fun. And maybe learn something interesting too. Usually these videos will focus on like retro games or comic books and stuff, or manga and anime. Sometimes stuff like old magazines too, or cults, you know. Cults. Like killer cults. Or, you know, something a bit more cheerful like room-centric hobbies like Romania. And the good news is, you can leave your home to watch us. You know, you don't have to stay home to watch us. You don't have to be stuck in one spot. Why? Because Wi-Fi! Did you know, basically, the first Wi-Fi standard was adopted in 1997. Yeah, it was 1999 when the Wi-Fi was added to Apple Books and stuff, but 1997, wow, what an interesting year.
A slow march into a new order.
So, for our first video, let's talk about a combo of retro video games, a tiny little bit of comic book and manga stuff, and most importantly, 1997! One thing Lucian has been babbling about is the year 1997, and most specifically, a topic that I'm sure is on all of your minds at this very moment. Something that really captures the cultural zeitgeist. Yup, you guessed it. What legendary video game publisher Square Enix was up to in the year of 1997. Anno Domini, of course. Featuring creepy cute critters and Sega Saturn. Well, you know, you'll see if you keep watching. And please do!
Now, see her walk by, peppermint coat, button-down clothes, buttoned up high. Diamonds and stones hang from her hand. Isn't she smart? Isn't she grand? I knew her.
So, 1997 was sort of a landmark year in gaming, but that isn't what this video will focus on. It's just good to know for context. Mostly, everybody knows the big games released in 1997, so let's see. Square Enix released Final Fantasy VII. We got Castlevania Symphony of the Night, GoldenEye, Star Fox 64. So basically, it was a pretty exciting time for games, as you can see. Like, CC, look! Tetrasphere! Anyways, one particularly exciting thing about 97 gaming news was a particular publisher, Enix, officially announced that year that the next installment of their extremely popular, at least in Japan, Dragon Quest franchise, it would be moved from the Nintendo 64 disk drive, a story in itself, for another time of course, to the new console king of the era, the Sony PlayStation! On January 17th of 97, IGN wrote, although they were by no means the only gaming outlet to do so, this is just an example. They wrote the following: stock in both Sony Corp and Enix Corp rose significantly in Japan yesterday, due primarily to Enix's announcement that it would develop Dragon Quest VII for the PlayStation. And so, the PlayStation started to sell even more consoles than it already was in 1977, in anticipation for a PlayStation Dragon Quest game, because that's just how big Dragon Quest was, at least in Japan. Already PS1 was, in that year at least in Japan, going from a sort of gaming console underdog to the top doggy against Nintendo and Sega. Though Sony was not exactly a startup or anything, but they were like the newcomer in the industry, taking on the veterans that were Nintendo and Sega. Due in part to the release of RPG games like Final Fantasy VII, a big business genre in Japan at the time, so Enix announcing the next Dragon Quest title on the PS4 further cemented PS1 as the RPG powerhouse console of 97, and yeah, it was a big move, a big play. But this was not the only announcement Enix made concerning publishing games for a 32-bit console that year. Also, in 97, Enix announced that they would begin to publish Saturn games as well, and this, some Saturn fans were hopeful that this would be a sort of injection for the Saturn after Sega had started to lose the console wars. But Enix did not say at the time what exactly they were going to publish for the Saturn, leading naturally to wild, baseless speculation. The best kind, I suppose, including the idea that one of the games they would publish might in fact be a Dragon Quest title. Concerning the status of a Dragon Quest title for the Saturn, there were conflicting reports. Some discounted the idea entirely as wishful thinking, but other console game enthusiasts were enthusiastic. Here, GamePro magazine's getting it, as they often did, confidently wrong. There is some good news on the PlayStation front. Longtime Japanese software company Enix, creators of Ogre Battle and Brain Lord for the SNES, is developing a Dragon Quest game for the Japanese PlayStation, and the game could possibly come to the US in 1998. This action represents a radical departure for Enix, which has traditionally made games for Nintendo systems only. A Dragon Quest game for the Japanese Saturn is also on the way, but no specific release dates for any Enix games were available at press time. So, the first game Enix will publish on the Saturn ended up being neither a mainline Dragon Quest title nor a Dragon Quest spin-off. Oh, but there was a dragon in this game, alright, but the dragon didn't look like this. More so, it looked like this. What the heck? Rather than a Dragon Quest title, the first Enix published Saturn game was something else, something in Lucian's opinion, so don't blame me for his crazy ideas. Something that was much more interesting. A video game with a very unique vision and pedigree designed with some sort of grotesque dignity. The name of the game was Nanatsu Kaze no Shima Monogatari, or The Story of the Island of Seven Winds. But due to collective anticipation for Saturn Dragon Quest news amongst gamers, the announcement of Nanatsu Kaze did not sound like a dragon's roar, but instead a whisper in the wind. Nanatsu Kaze no Shima Monogatari released in Japan on November 27, 1997. It is an offbeat 2D adventure game in which you play as Garp, a dragon on a quest. It was developed by a company by the name of, at the time, Givro Corporation. Now, before we look at Nanatsu Kaze in detail, to better understand what makes it such a special game, let's first focus a bit on the team of programmers, developers, sprite artists, and so forth that would end up making such a special game. Let's focus on Givro. Givro was a game development company originally founded under the name Almanac Corporation in 1989, and the company name would change to Givro Corp in 1995. Among other titles, Givro founder Takashi Yoneda worked on Quintet's ActRaiser, which was published by, you guessed it, Enix. ActRaiser was a sort of hybrid side-scrolling hack and slash god simulation game where in the overhead sim portions you lend an angelic hand to human civilization, your children, as it were, so that humanity could survive and thrive through the ages. Yoneda's first work as a director in Almanac/Givro was a game that was also related to civilization growth, and actually came out months before ActRaiser did. And that game was 46 Okunen Monogatari, the Shinkaron, or the 4.6 billion year story, The Theory of Evolution, released in 1990 for PC 98 computer systems and published by, you guessed it, Enix. Enix would be a major publisher for games developed by Almanac/Givro, and one reason for this is explained by then Givro president Noriyuki Toriyama in the June 6, 1997 edition of Sega Saturn magazine, which I, Lapin, have translated from Japanese to English for you, the viewer. He explains, Enix understands the importance of, quote-unquote, making good games. That's why we ended up creating Nanatsu Kaze no Shima Monogatari. For example, while longer development periods tend to increase production costs, they told us, quote-unquote, take your time and wait for a great result. As a creator, that's very much appreciated. So, as you can see, based on Givro's first game title, 4.6 billion year story, The Theory of Evolution, it sounds quite, ambitious. And ambitious is a word Lucian would use to describe nearly all Gibro games, whether it be the ones that had to be rushed out or the games that were allowed decent development time. Anyways, in 46 Okunen, which is basically a turn-based RPG, you begin life as a lowly aquatic critter and are tasked with evolving your way through a survival of the fittest world until you become a bipedal capable of reaching and colonizing even the stars. One sort of through line in Gibro games, in a way, is learning or evolving. They are often games about growth, evolution, metamorphosis, and so forth. This aspect is evident not just in 46 Okunen, but also in its SNES/Super Famicom counterpart, also directed by Yoneda. The side-scrolling action-adventure titled Evo: Search for Eden, published by Enix in 92 in Japan and a year later in 93 in the United States. The aspect of growth occurs again in Gibro's Wonder Project J-Series, also published by Enix. And both games in the J-Series are also directed by Yoneda, and in these games you help teach Pinocchio-esque robots how to be more human-like and oversee their growth, their evolution, and that sort of thing. And so it is no surprise that the idea of metamorphosis is also present in traces of Nanatsu Kaze no Shima Monogatari. The opening gameplay sequence even involves our lead character, Garp, breaking out of an egg, with little help from the player, of course, and into a new form, and into a new world. But so too present in Nanatsu Kaze is another Givro trademark or calling card, multi-joint animation. Only Givro can pull this off. There are supposedly words relayed by Enix in regards to assigning Giro to the development of Nanatsu Kaze, according to an interview with Tomiyama on June 6, 1997 edition of Sega Saturn magazine. As to why Enix was pursuing the Nanatsu Kaze project in the first place, I'll explain that in a bit. First, let's look at the interview a little more in regards to Giro's quote-unquote multi-joint animation specialty. Tomiyama stated, "The biggest challenge was how to make the character parts move. That's when Hayakawa suggested, how about animating with separate parts? To clarify, Hayakawa is Naoki Hayakawa, and at Givro he was, again, according to the Saturn magazine issue, in charge of animating the movements of the characters and objects on screen. He is particularly focused on multi-joint action, which gives the characters an incredibly lifelike, realistic motion. He encourages players to pay attention to this aspect of the animation. Hayakawa states in the same issue about this technique. It is a type of quote-unquote multi-joint animation. We use this technique to animate large characters in Mazen Saga. I thought that with this technique, we could animate even illustrated characters smoothly and beautifully. You might be asking yourself, well, what is Mazen Saga exactly? I'm glad you asked. It's another Gibro game, and the article explains further, of course. The know-how of multi-joint animation dates back to those days. During the interview, the topic of Mazen Saga for the Sega Mega Drive came up. This was a game based on the popular manga Mazinger Z by Go Nagai, released in Sega in 1993. The game used multi-joint technology for the protagonist's movement, which was quite innovative at the time. The realistic, almost biological movements became a huge topic of discussion. Here you can see Die Hard Game Fan magazine praising Giro's multi-joint skills in their November 94 issue. While reviewing Giro's Sega 32X Fighter Cyber Brawl, as it is known in Japan, more commonly known as Cosmic Carnage in the US, which is another game that used the multi-joint technique, which also features a cybernetic snake lady with an Ojo-sama left, just to illustrate a bit of the oddball but charming nature of Giro, and a very interesting game in its own right. So you see, Giro had a reputation for its multi-joint sprite work. In here, check this out! So you get a better idea of how it works. Realistic movements with multi-joint characters by combining parts. Unlike traditional cell animation, which uses a large number of overall patterns, multi-joint animation divides the body into smaller parts and animates the joints. Looking at the breakdown diagram below, you can see just how detailed the approach is. Not only the joints, but even the soft parts of the body, like long ears or belly fat, sway, creating an incredibly smooth and lifelike movements. Hayakawa further explains, we prepared separate parts for each angle, front, side, and back. So even when the character changes motion, the movement remains smooth. Another Giro employee, Norihiro Sawada, continues, especially for Garp, since he is the main character, we made sure to have parts for almost every possible angle, up to 360 degrees. In terms of attention to detail, we focused on making sure that the character's left side was properly lowered. But why? Why all this focus on smooth movement? Why go so far anyways? Well, that has more than a little something to do with Nanatsu Kaze no Shima Monogatari's director. And despite Nanatsu Kaze being a game with ties to growth and metamorphosis, and being a culmination of Giro's work, sharing largely the same programmers, it was not directed by Yoneda as the Evo and Wonder Project J games were, even if it seems like he would have been a natural fit. Instead, Yoneda receives only a special thanks in the credits to Nanatsu Kaze, as the game was directed by someone else instead, someone who had actually never worked with Giro before. And that someone was Keita Amamiya, monster creator mastermind and special effects extraordinaire. In simple terms, Keita Amamiya is a prolific artist and designer, and also a film and television director with decades of experience. He's worked on and directed special effects in heavy cult films like Seiran 1 and 2, Mirai Ninja, Moon Over Tao, as well as tokusatsu television related projects like Garo. He created designs for Metal Heroes, the TV franchise, during his early days, worked on Sentai shows like Jetman, and directed Kamen Rider movies for the Toei Superhero Fair events like Kamen Rider Zeo in 1993 and Kamen Rider J in 1994. And also directed the centerpiece installment of the fair in 95, the Mechanical Violator Hokkaido film, an atmospheric spin-off of Kikaider with a troubled but very interesting production history, which also spawned a sequel in the form of Hokkaido's Sega Saturn game in late 96. As a boy, Amamiya was a big fan of Ultraman and Kamen Rider, and he was also a fan of Akira Kurosawa and Star Wars. It is really easy to notice an Amamiya design with their flowy, calligraphic, asymmetrical stylings. As an artist, Amamiya is a standout, of course, distinct amongst even his peers, and he is in good company in that regard, actually. He went to Asagaya Art College in 1978, and while there, he met other talented Asagaya students that would go on to become well-renowned. Artists like Takayuki Takeya, Katsuya Terada, Yasushi Nirasawa, Masakazu Katsura, and among others, many more. Many of these artists, generally underclassmen to Amamiya, would go on to work on various projects with him over the years. And well, I'm sure you are thinking, that is great and all. His work definitely looks impressive, powerful and bold. He's got style. And he's a special effects guru for sure. But what is his relationship with Enix? With Gibro? Yeah, he's a film director, but how did he end up as a game director for this 1997 Sega Saturn exclusive Nanatsu Kaze, which looks quite different from what is being displayed on screen currently, at least in terms of the fearsomeness of the designs, or lack thereof in the Natsukaze's case, of the fat dragon with wings that can barely lift him off the ground. I will explain. Amamiya did not limit applying his visionary skills to just television and film. He also has quite an affinity for video games. I quote, I play games almost every day, and the ones I spend the most time on are games whose atmosphere I fall in love with. Keita Amamiya is quoted saying this in an issue of Famitsu in July of 2013. And his interest in special effect works and games sort of collided in regards to the 1989 movie Mirai Ninja, Amamiya's first film directorial job. See, during his early design days, Amamiya had done the character designs for Namco's side-scrolling hack and slash game Genpei Tomaden, a 1986 arcade game in which the player controls a sort of ghost samurai seeking vengeance. And that game was a success. So he was then hired by Namco to do the designs for Mirai Ninja, another Namco game. Somewhere along the line, Namco decided they wanted a tie-in movie to go with Mirai Ninja. And Amamiya ended up being chosen to direct the live-action film to coincide with the arcade game's release. Amamiya's stylish direction on the Mirai Ninja film, and of course also his design and special effects work, got him noticed for more work in the film and TV industry, and thus his career in the game industry has always been intertwined with his film and TV career. He has bounced back and forth between them over the years. You probably have seen some of Amamiya's designs in games actually, whether it be his work for Onimusha 2, or Clock Tower 3, PS2 Dororo game, or Genji. Actually, you also might have seen his work in Shin Megami Tensei 4. So yeah, Amamiya has worked on a lot of things. One of Lucian's favorite gaming visual design work Amamiya did is for the Super Famicom game Hagane, which bears a resemblance to Mirai Ninja as it also features a cybernetic ninja protagonist. Another fun Super Famicom title Amamiya was involved in is Treasure of the Rudras, an RPG released in 1996 by Square. And even with his forays into gaming, generally what Amamiya is most known for these days is his tokusatsu work, particularly Garo. So clearly disturbing monsters and demons are staples of Amamiya's art, and many of these designs will be of the bipedal variety, with generally human shapes. due to the nature of them being related to practical effects in tokusatsu shows or movies, where a human being will be wearing the costume, of course, lending a pretty cool and kind of grotesque look. It's definitely a cool factor. And yet, there is also another side to Amamiya's work, a side a far cry away from those brutal biological demons he is so adept at designing, a side that is instead very whimsical and soft, calming and painterly. Fairy tale-esque, some might say, or even storybook-esque. And this other side of his art is why Kiro spent so much time getting these smooth, multi-jointed sprite animations, perfect for Nanatsu Kaze. And this other side also explains why Amamiya was chosen as the director of the game in the first place. So, welcome to the other side. Okay, phew, we've made it to the other side, another world. To the world of the seven winds, the world of Iho Kenbon Roku, which translates to something like Record of Foreign Lands or Memoir of Foreign Lands. So that's what Iho Kenbon Roku means, but what Iho Kenbon Roku is a series of illustrations Keita Amamiya created. Highly intricate fantasy artworks paired with a little bit of text that tells the tale of a particular chubby little dragon professor you have already become acquainted with throughout this video. Garp! More formally known as Professor Garp, who will eventually go on to become the star of the Nanatsu Kaze Sega Saturn game. But before we get to Nanatsu Kaze, let's take one last detour and focus on Iho Kenbon Roku, the predecessor to the Natsukaze, that is. A perfect example of Amamiya's quote-unquote other side fairy tale art style, a style that Giro will later emulate successfully in Lucian's opinion. In the pixel form in Nanatsu Kaze. Basic concept of Amamiya's Iho Kenbon Roku illustration series is that Garp decides to travel the world of the Seven Winds to gain inspiration for his writings. So over the course of these artworks, the viewer will gain some insight into this mysterious, unique world setting populated with weird, little, and sometimes not so little critters. Most likely, Garp is a literature professor, or something of this sort. Or at least that's what is implied by his title and desire to write. So basically, Iho Kenbon Roku is a travelogue, a memoir written by Garp to memorialize the strange sights he sees on his somewhat silly but often oddly endearing journey. And this record, this memoir, is an early chapter in the formation of the story that will eventually become Nanatsu Kaze. The first Iho Kenbon Roku illustration, titled The Peddler of Zagore, was published in 1999 in issue 73 of Bandai's B Club magazine, which was a magazine that focused on model kits, mecha, tokusatsu, etc. A magazine Amamiya was often featured in, but not all of the Iho Kenbon Roku artworks appear in issues of B Club. Amamiya continued Iho Kenbon Roku beyond the B Club publication out of a desire to quote-unquote create and draw what he wanted without thinking at all about current trends or popularity. And definitely the art has a somewhat different style from his commercial works out there. As I mentioned earlier, a storybook-esque style, with less focus on cool creatures and more on creepy cute ones, which probably was not in vogue at the time. Is it even in vogue now? In Amamiya's 1992 art book collection, Kiba/Fang, which collects the Iho Kenbon Roku series into one book, Amamiya states, although this drawing style appears smooth at first glance, it actually takes me more time than any other artwork I create, and since the standard of quality is something I set for myself, it can be the most troublesome. So Amamiya put a lot of work into this series of very precise illustrations, in contrast to the bold line calligraphic style he is most known for. And each illustration has a text accompanying it to help paint a larger picture of the world of the Seven Winds. Take the peddler or the merchant of Zagore, for example. The first Iho Kenbon Roku illustration, which I, the fantastic Lapin, have humbly translated for your viewing and listening pleasure. From the notes of Professor Garp, that day I set out for the forest of Zagor. Today On the day when the third wind blows, Old Tam from Daichi-sen will come to sell her goods. As usual, Old Tam was a skilled merchant, and even though I, a dragon person, didn't need them, she managed to sell me some raki seeds. I couldn't get the oil-free lantern I wanted, but I was fortunate to buy a strong mouthpiece resistant to the fourth wind. This was lucky because in 20 days, when the fourth spring wind blows, I will set on a journey. Traveling in this land of seven winds is a challenging task, but there is a sight I must simply imprint on my eyes. When I told Otama about my journey, she suggested I take along Kisuke, the hedgehog tailor who was helping her with her trade. Perhaps she was worried about losing one of her good customers while I was away. Of course, I didn't pay for Kisuke. So the first installment in the series gives glimpses of Garp's journey to come, mentioning the quote-unquote third wind and the impending fourth wind, and introduces not just Garp but also Old Tam, who will appear in Nanatsu Kaze as a merchant, and Kisuke, the hedgehog tailor. Kisuke is described in the June 6, 1997 issue of Sega Saturn magazine as the curious and energetic mouse child Kisuke, who is always full of energy, darting around the island. Truly elusive, he uses his scissor-like hands to cut anything he comes across, making him quite the mischievous character. And Kisuke is a standout character not just in the Iho Kenbon Roku stories, but also in the Natsukaze, where he's one of the three helpers that, well, help Garp traverse the island of the seven winds. He is also a bit of a favorite character of Amamiya. Amamiya actually created Kisuke much earlier than 1999, though Kisuke's early design looked a bit different. Here is what Kisuke looked like when Amamiya drew him in 1983. And Amamiya's notes on this version of Kisuke in his 1992 Kiba art book explains, you could call this the quote-unquote real version of Kisuke, although this character was created earlier, so technically speaking, it would be more accurate to describe Kisuke as the cute version of this character. These characters are part of a world I've envisioned since my early 20s, one that I've always dreamed of someday turning into a visual production and possibly a film. Similarly, there are also images of Garp reproduced in the Kiba art book, images originally created by Amamiya in 1983. So Amamiya had the idea of using these characters for quite some time before implementing them into Iho Kenbon Roku, later Nanatsu Kaze. Further evidence of this is presented in an interview in the Nanatsu Kaze official art book / storybook, where Amamiya reveals, when I was in high school, I became really interested in working on picture books, and I thought that Garp's world could one day be put together into fairy tales or something like that when I grew up. I was expanding on it in various ways. However, at the time, there was a band boom, and music and sport figures were really popular. Wanting to become a picture book author felt kind of uncool. I only showed my drawings to very close friends. In total, there are 9 Iho Kenbon Roku stories collected in the Kiba art book, and 7 of the 9 are Garp's travel notes, one of which is a fun story of him fishing, a feature that is later implemented as a game mechanic in the Natsukaze. And overhearing a twin-headed crab, characters that also appear in the Natsukaze, argue with itself and slash one another over a game of Bushin Shogi. These travel notes sometimes mention Garp's writer's block, and the journey helps him overcome that. The final Iho Kenbon Roku tales are actually excerpts of Garp's fiction writings inspired by his journey, with titles The Hare Who Became a Lion and The One-Winged Dragon Knight. As a side note, Lucian believes, and he has no concrete proof of this, so it is all baseless speculation, which, as I said earlier, is the best kind. But Lucian believes Professor Garp is potentially named after John Irving's book The World According to Garp, first published in English in 1978, which was later adapted into a movie starring Robin Williams in 1982. The protagonist in The World According to Garp is a writer named, well, Garp. And some of this character's writing excerpts are presented throughout the novel, sort of like how 2 of the 9 Iho Kenbon Roku stories are excerpts of Dragon Garp's own writings. Also, Garp in the Robin Williams movie wishes he could fly, and Dragon Garp has also trouble flying. In the Irving novel, Garp moves to Vienna to gain the inspiration to write, and Dragon Garp travels to other locations to do the same. Although the book and the movie were apparently not big sellers or anything over in Japan, the movie was dubbed in Japanese in 1988, and the book was first released in Japanese in 1983. And if Japanese Wikipedia is to be believed, the novel caught the attention of well-known Japanese writers Kenzaburo Oe and Haruki Murakami. So it is not like it would be inconceivable that Amamiya would know of Irving's book title. Still, none of this is proven. It is just an idea Lucian has been entertaining in his fluff-filled head. Usually he is wrong, so don't listen to him. Listen to me instead, Lapin, okay? Well, I won't explain what happens in all 9 stories, unless someone out there is really interested, and then maybe Lucian and I could make a video focusing solely on them, but you get the idea. First, there existed Ihokemon Roku, and then a few years later, Enix came calling. In Sega Saturn's magazine, Amamiya states, Enix first approached me with the idea of making a game. They told me that they would leave the content entirely up to me and wanted me to make the game I most wanted to create. That's when I realized that if I were able to take responsibility for something all the way to the end, it had to be a world centered around Professor Garp and the others. And so, the world that is depicted in Nanatsu Kaze was always an important one to Amamiya, a world he carried with him and expressed his uncommercial fairy tale style art for many years before getting involved with Enix to create it in game form. Thus, it makes sense that the quality of the work was a big concern for him, that whoever programmed the game, whoever did the sprite work and backgrounds for the game, would need to get it just right. And it also explains why, really, Amamiya was the only logical choice for the game director in this instance, because it is his world, his characters, his story, and his art. To present this quote-unquote picture book, fairy tale world as accurately as possible, to match the amazingly detailed work Amamiya had already put into the world of the Seven Winds with Ihokemon Roku, the programmers would need to be able to convey that smoothness, the detail-oriented world, in a way that cuts no corners, and naturally Amamiya needed to be there to oversee the entire project. So, yeah. All of this is why Gibro was so intent on using the multi-joint sprite technique, and also why they put such a focus on creating smooth movements, and why Amamiya was chosen as the game director over anyone from Gibro who had more experience. Well, I hope that this in-depth explanation makes everything clear. Basically, everything I've talked about up to this point is to show that Nanatsu Kaze was not created in a vacuum. It did not just hatch from an egg formed in our world. First, it existed in another world, in the creative mind of Keita Amamiya, being built upon and refined and strengthened over many years before reaching its final form. The seed was planted as a high school picture book dream, then sprouted and shown to the public in the 80s when Amamiya entered his early fairy tale work into an art contest. Although he did not win, but he did receive an honorable mention, before flowering into the impressive Ihokemon Roku in 1991, and finally bearing the fruit that is Nanatsu Kaze, copies of which were dispersed as if scattered by the wind. In late 1997, to unsuspecting Japanese gamers simply hoping for another Enix Dragon Quest title, Nanatsu Kaze's creation was quite the journey. And similarly, concerning the programmers and designers and artists at Kivro, they took what they learned from their previous games and improved their multi-joint sprite skills, honed their craft for creating offbeat, ambitious games, and applied it all to Nanatsu Kaze to create what is their sort of swan song of sorts, an uncommercial but, in Lucian's view, a very pleasing, soothing, but emotional experience, provided you are attuned to its admittedly niche wavelength. Hopefully all of this info gives context, so you can see the intent of the game, that Nanatsu Kaze was never meant to be in the vein of Dragon Quest. It was never meant to compete with the top-selling games of the era. It was always sort of going to be an under-the-radar game, yet Lucian contends it is a game of high quality nevertheless. Now finally, let us behold Nanatsu Kaze no Shima Monogatari! Now that everyone watching understands who Keita Amamiya is, what Kibra was, and has seen the world of Iho Kenbon Roku, and been introduced to the rotund Professor Garp and the mischief maker Kisuke, it is now time for the main event of this video, that is Nanatsu Kaze. How to begin? Nanatsu Kaze is an adventure game, but rather it is probably more apt to call it an exploration game, if there is such a distinction. I would actually say that there is a distinction. An adventure sort of implies a glorious journey, but the journey in Natsukaze is often more low-key. In the Sega Saturn magazine interview, I have been referencing this entire video, which I will shorten to SSM from now on. Amamiya states, I still don't really think of it as an adventure game. I said adventure just for the convenience, because it's easier for game magazines to understand. Originally, I was thinking of a completely non-combat RPG. Instead of showing the story, the idea was for the game to be like a small world where the player becomes one with a character and lives in that world. In this world, you could catch bugs, make insect specimens, fish, collect parts to build a car, and even race. You could also play music by blowing a whistle. It was a world where everything I wanted to do could be included. Basically, Amamiya wanted to make Animal Crossing before Animal Crossing was a thing. And yes, you can collect parts to build and race a car in Natsukaze actually. I wasn't kidding. Oh, and you know how in Animal Crossing, the characters have funny voices? Nanatsukaze does something kind of similar, and so does Moon RPG Remix Adventure, another quite special 1997 video game, and one Amamiya has mentioned before. The villagers of the Seven Winds Islands make weird sounds or gestures to converse, and then a sort of storybook text box will pop up, and according to the SSM interview, a quote-unquote third-party narrator will provide subtitles to convey what the character might be saying, like a translator. The game is likened to a box garden by Tomiyama in SSM. He states, this is Amamiya's world compressed into a box garden. Every time you power the game, these characters come to life and show their presence in front of you. When the power is turned off, they fall asleep. Even though the characters are born from fantasy, they feel as though they have real life, and there's a sense that they exist in this world. Amamiya also elaborates on why he chose a low-key storytelling style in the Picture Imagination book. He states, there aren't really any clear stories with a beginning, middle, and end. What I usually imagine is more like my everyday life, for example. Going to the tobacco shop because I ran out of cigarettes, only to find out that they didn't have any. Or hearing a rumor from someone about a delicious wine, and then they went to the town and bought 2 bottles. That's the kind of world it is, where Garp and strange creatures appear in these small everyday scenes. So there's no rising action, climax, or huge events happening at all. So rather than an adventure game, let's say Nanatsu Kaze is an exploration game on a 2D plane, and behind that plane you will see quite lush, beautiful backgrounds. Initially drawn by Amamiya and then translated to the game with the help of Yatsuo Wakatsuki, backgrounds painstakingly detailed to complement the equally impressive character sprite work. Givros Tomiyama explained that, quote-unquote, the ability to display multiple layers of backgrounds really helped us out in the 1997 SSM interview. A background layer feature, he said, was at the time unique to the Saturn hardware. But enough about box gardens and Saturn specs for now. And let's focus on the game's gameplay. Well, it is pretty basic. Once you hatch and are born into the world of the Seven Winds, you, as a newborn, old-bodied Professor Garp, learn to walk left and right with the directional pad. You can enter doors with the up direction, descend steps with down or ascend with up. You can use the A button to talk, to pick up items, and by chapter 2 and onward, you can run by holding A while using the left or right D-pad. You can jump with the B button and you can attempt to fly and fail at doing so by rapidly pressing it. The C button will open the menu screen, and then you can use the X, Y, and Z buttons to access your various useful items, like your wind wands and your color-coded horns, your fishing rod, or even this interesting looking bug catcher here, which is modeled after Nintendo legend Gunpei Yokoi's Ultra Hand Tongue toy. And there are many other interesting items you will use for various puzzles or to simply collect. So you can store them in your cozy treehouse cabinets. In Garb's literal treehouse, you can also save the game by resting in his comfy chair. And you can view a storybook which contains info of all the other inhabitants on the island and other items and objects. Access to knowledge that will be helpful to you on your various quests in the game. One thing I should note is, as stated in SSM interview, is that there are no commands or prompts that appear on the screen in the game. Instead, players control Garp and are free to act accordingly to their own decisions. And perhaps no better section indicates this concept than the very beginning of the game, in which you are present with just a giant spiked egg. Perhaps you wait a bit to see what will happen, and when nothing does, you hit the A button, but still nothing happens. So you try some other button. Nothing. So you tap the A button again, and then the B button again. And finally, pieces of the egg begin to crack. And you keep pressing the B button or jump button until Garp hatches, and you can explore your new surroundings in earnest. So yeah, it is very much an exploration game, which you can enjoy at your own pace. Though there is also a narrative that unfolds over your time on this island of many mysteries. In SSM, Amamiya states, when asked if there is something he'd like the players to feel or experience when they play the game, more than anything, I want them to play it until the very end. If there is a stone, try moving it. Or experience the fundamental things that humans think about. I think those kinds of puzzles are the purest form of mystery. Solving them can be really fun. Also, if players come to like one of the characters, I think playing in this little world will definitely become enjoyable. I should also mention something about the gameplay that is pretty unique for this type of 2D scrolling game. Well, firstly, side-scrolling is the term that is used in the SSM interview to describe the movement, but it's actually more accurate to call it a flip screen game, as the screens do not transition until you reach the near edge, but maybe you could call it a side stroller. Due to the leisurely pace, Garb does move quite slow after all, which I'm sure was the point of contention for less patient players when it was released. But anyway, the point is, there is an aspect of gameplay generally in these type of games that this one lacks. Nanatsu Kaze is a game devoid entirely of fighting, at least on your end. Garb certainly takes his fair share of punishment over the course of his quest, but you certainly won't be crushing turrets with the jump button in this game, or using the wind wand and their powerful magic properties to wipe out waves of relentless foes. Now, obviously, no combat is not unique for puzzle-solving adventure games like Myst with third-person views, or even 2D adventure games like something from LucasArts back in the day, point-and-click types. Or later-era games like Animal Crossing. But for a 2D game like this, where the primary method of controlling the character is set up like a traditional action platformer or side-scroller, it was pretty rare in 1997. I feel that it is rare even now, actually. As an aside, why is it a 2D side-scroller platforming type of game anyways? That is kind of an odd choice for a puzzle game, right? Well, this choice is another thing Amamiya requested Giro to pull off. One reason is because if you look at Ihoken Monroku, a lot of the arts are already set up in this manner, with the staging, and one of the goals of the creation of Nanatsu Kaze was to emulate the look of these artworks. At the time, 2D was much better choice than 3D for that purpose. But another reason it was made as it was, without stage selects and whatnot, is because of the huge connected island the game takes place in. Tomiyama in SSM says, the director wanted to make sure that players could experience the scale of a large island. To do that, we couldn't just switch camera cuts around constantly. The path had to be continuous, so the player could really feel the size of the island. Sawada continues, the key concept is that the island is connected as a whole. When you take 10 steps forward, the area you walk through should be part of the same world. But we didn't want the experience to just be around strolling around the island for fun. We needed to figure out how to shape it into a playable game while keeping it engaging. There is no combat, but there are still plenty of enjoyable elements prepared for the player. Tomiyama again. At one point, we considered structuring it like a picture book, where you change screens as if flipping pages, but doing so would have broken the connected island concept. Well, now you know. Anyways, back to the lack of combat. Instead of fisticuffs, Garp's primary method of conflict resolution, of problem solving, is lending a helping hand to other villagers on the island, fixing problems for them, making them happy, making friends, remembering them, remembering their names. And that is a very important part of the game. Names. Remembering their names is the name of the game, basically. One without a name is forgotten. One who is forgotten does not exist in this world. That is a theme of the game's story, and not to spoil too much, but I will have to spoil a bit to explain this well enough, but it is also very important for the gameplay aspect as well. You need to learn the name of the other villagers in the game and input them at crucial times. In some cases, you have to actually give names to the villagers. But it is key to remember those names. You may actually get stuck in the game if you forget them, but you wouldn't do that, would you? What kind of monster forgets their friends' names, Oh, Lucius? You will also be asked to name your favorite thing at the start of the game. Lucian thinks the name feature is quite charming. Yeah, it is a simple thing. How many times have you been asked to input a name at the start of a video game? A bunch. Almost all the time. But now, how many times do you really think about it? It just gives a little flavor. Sometimes people will just put in random silly things without thinking. It doesn't matter, it's just a game. But in Nanatsu Kaze, it matters. When you are asked to input a character's name in this game, you are meant to remember it, and the moments when you must recall a name and input it actually harken back to what Amamiya considers the trigger for creating Nanatsu Kaze. The trigger is simple, it's Peter Pan. In the scene where Tinkerbell dies, the mother tells the child, "If you believe in fairies, clap your hands. Then Tinkerbell will come back to life." When I learned that story, I was a bit shocked. From there, it wasn't interactive, but I thought it was amazing that old books had elements like that. So the concept isn't necessarily new, it's inspired by old fairy tales. Maybe this is a little confusing to understand, but basically what Lucian thinks Amamiya is saying is that he wanted to tell a fairy tale story but using the interactive video game medium to mold the readers, or in this case, player, in a similar fashion of this pivotal Peter Pan moment. Sort of like how in the stage play version of Peter Pan, the audience is asked to clap to bring Tinkerbell back to life. In Nanatsu Kaze, though, I will avoid any direct spoilers, maybe using your name inputs to do something similar. And yeah, all of gaming is interactive. But Amamiya has kind of a fascinating way to view that interaction between player and stories. I don't want to spoil too much of it, though. There are quite a few villagers that populate the island of the Seven Winds, and they range in importance from major to minor. Villagers like Rockman. No, this is a different one. Rockman Jimstone. As translated by this humble genius, Lapin. From the in-game storybook, Rockman Jimstone is a young stone gentleman, nimble and light on his feet, who is surprisingly fond of children. He is searching for a friend. Or how about Covet, the wardrobe man, a quiet resident of the grass square. He is a hard-headed man who turns away after a word or two, even when people try to talk to him. And who will ever forget Tennen Bitora Ronso? This name doesn't really mean anything from what I can tell, aside from Tennen and Bitora seeming to resemble Tennen Hito, or innocent being in Japanese. Tennen Bitora Ronso is a resident who lives in a hole and is known for the nickname Dancing Dweller. The romanji for his nickname is likely wordplay on his big nose. Odoru is a loan word for odor, so Odoru Junen is the pronunciation for his nickname. Friendly still, you still can't tell what it's thinking. This is just a small sample of the large cast of villagers, but every character on the island has a unique name, a crazy, visually striking look, a quirk to their personality. There is a lot of wordplay going on with these fellows too. A lot of attention was put into their individual creations. But the question is, even with all these characters' flares, their pizzazz, if you didn't know the name mechanic stuff and how important it is to the game, would you be paying attention to all these critters? Or would you memorize the name of that silly looking NPC you barely interacted with? Or did you ever talk to them in the first place to even learn their name? Since they weren't required to progress the plot at all. Sometimes, as gamers, we are just flying through games to get to the end so we can move on to the next title without enjoying all the finer points along the way. Natsukaze is about taking a step back rather than forward, to remember, to reflect. I mean, obviously a person can play a game however they want, but it is just an interesting thing to look at, to think about, or at least Lucian thinks so. If you ask me, he would fit right in with these strange villagers. Anyway, you as Garp traverse the huge connected island of the Seven Winds and puzzle solve, and a lot of the solutions involve calling upon the friends you make along the way to help you out just as you help them. The first friend you acquaint yourself with, for example, is Kisuke, the hedgehog tailor from Iho Kenbon Roku. But how does this little guy lend his own helping hands when his hands are scissors? Well, there is a lot of grass to mow on this island. Actually, mostly you will call upon him, using the blue horn item you acquire, to cut through thorny paths or trees so you can access more areas on the island that Garp would not be able to get to alone. Kisuke can also cut flowers, or fruit, or wood, or other such material, so you can gather them as items. One cool thing about this is that Kisuke has a variety of cutting animations, depending on what object he is interacting with. So if it is grass low onto the ground you want him to cut, he might do a trimming animation, just a little off the top. Compared to his more impressive athletic feats when it comes to slicing down some bamboo-esque trees, the attention to detail in this game is a cut above. Please don't leave me. Lucian made me say that. Similarly, you can also call upon the help of Kurayon, using the red horn, described as a shy and sickly propeller rabbit child in Sega Saturn magazine, who can spin his ears like a propeller to help you, as Garp, fly through the air, since Garp cannot fly on his own despite his dragon status. And then you can use a yellow horn to call upon Rokujo, the frog child with thick nerves who can break rocks blocking your path by inflating his cheeks with air to produce a loud sound. In addition to calling your friends, another game mechanic involves the wind wands or wind whips, made from the roots of a flying tree. These are collected throughout the game after you complete various objectives, and they too will help open up the connected island world. Each whip conjures up one of the 7 winds, so we finally get to see the difference between those various winds briefly mentioned in Iho Kenbon Roku. One wind will alter your size so you can fit into smaller spaces. Another wind has healing properties, and so forth. It is quite involved. Well, I kind of mentioned the collecting element, but I did not say too much about it. There are many items you can collect throughout the game. Some are important to the story, some you might give to other villagers, but a lot of them just exist for your own viewing pleasure. You can catch and trade insects. You can arrange objects on a cabinet in Garp's tree home, a cabinet which holds secrets within its drawers, etc. Whoa! Fishing! You can fish! Just as Garb does in the classic Iho Kenbon-roku illustration, involving a contentious game of Bushin Shogi. Any fishing in a video game is usually relaxing, and so too it is in Nanatsu Kaze. And of course there are some rare fish to be on the lookout for, and some rare insects if you prefer to collect those. But since this is the upper land of the 7 winds, these are not your garden variety of fishes and bugs. No. These are Amamiya's box garden variety. Varieties such as Hotayo, or the bandage fish, a fish unique to the island, swimming with its drooping fins quivering pitifully. It can be caught relatively easy at the lake's open area. Neketsuo, or the hot-blooded fish, a very common fish in Tamaria and the lake's open area. It's rather unwavering, so it charges straight ahead even in small spaces. The ichigo, or strawberry fish, a fish with a beautiful body color, often mentioned alongside the applefish. It can be caught relatively easily in the island's lakes and puddles. The suzuo, or bellfish, a fish that can be caught relatively easily in any sea around Nanokaze Island. Its body color and adorable face make it a popular ornamental fish. Or check out the insects. The hatena, or question bug, a very rare insect found in the upper part of the island. It prefers damp, hot environments where mushrooms grow. And the dangomushi, or peel bug, an insect that inhabits a wide area of the central part of the island. Its distinctive traits are its peculiar quirky movements and skewer-like body shape. And I could go on, but you get it, and many more. In the imagination book, Amamiya states, the insect catching and fishing are very complicated, and the factors that cause insects to appear, for example, are very deep and well developed. So please try to catch and play a lot. I can recommend it to you. And he also states, in Nanatsu no Shima Monogatari, there are little things that didn't really matter from a gameplay perspective, but we kept them in because they were interesting. The fishing and insect and item collection sections, there are things you can do just for fun. There's an insect here, and you might want to have to catch it for a villager looking for it to advance some task. But generally, there are free time activities in this game. But regardless of their lack of importance to the overall completion of the game, a lot of thought and detail was spent on them in their designs and their programming. So I think this sort of encapsulates the gameplay of Nanatsu Kaze. It is simple in execution, but there is a lot going on behind the scenes. I mentioned all of this stuff before I mentioned the actual story of Nanatsu Kaze because, well, I don't want to spoil too much of the story. As you have gathered, this is a very much play-it-yourself type of game, where you will get the most enjoyment out of trying to solve puzzles and so forth without being told exactly what comes next. And even though it is a game you can complete at your own pace, it does have storybook chapters that occur once you solve simple tasks. And eventually, a quite powerful and moving narrative will become clear. The game is very much in a sort of proto-Animal Crossing vein. And yeah, like Amamiya stated, there are no demon lords to defeat. It is a story you unravel on your own, starting with low-stake tasks, but these small threads do eventually lead to something bigger, bolder, and a dark, ominous wind begins to blow over the island. Because of the black wind sweeping through, Nanakaze Island falls into an eerie silence. The wind user who can save the island, Garp. The dragon-born burdened with sin, Garp. A mysterious voice calls Garp, the one who remained on the island, by these names. The final mystery left on Nanakaze Island, the remaining one last wind. Two massive statues facing each other, the full moon and the crescent moon. Mooni, the lunar being who witnessed everything. All secrets lie within the dream Garp will see. The dream of his final previous year. What happened in Garp's past year, that was the beginning of everything. From the Nanatsu Kaze no Shima Monogatari picture book. You'll notice I've left off something pretty major over the course of this video when talking about Nanatsu Kaze, and that major missing thing is the story. Now, I showed you patient viewers quotes earlier about how Amamiya did not want to structure the game's story in a typical way, but nonetheless, eventually an overarching narrative does emerge throughout your exploration. But because Lucian thinks this is quite a nice story, I'll try not to spoil much of it. So what follows is just a bare bones version that hopefully keeps the twists and turns of the tale under wraps and still piques enough interest for the currently uninitiated. Okay. Once you, as Garp, hatch into the island of the Seven Winds, the first thing you, Garp, will interact with on the island is a strange black claw. When you inspect it, Garp will feel a sense of nostalgia, though he does not know why. Then Garp will settle in as a new villager and learn that one day a quote-unquote black wind blew through the island and erased its story. Could the black claw and the black wind be related? So, you will start to go about the island in Garp's rotund and wobbly way, creating your own story, which usually involves helping out villagers, and in doing so, you will replace the blank pages in the island storybook with vivid recollections of your quest. The blank storybook will start to fill anew, and in this manner, the game is divided into chapters to fit with the off-kilter fairy tale aesthetic. Over the course of these chapters, Garp will not only make new friends, he will also acquire more wind rods capable of channeling wind magic. The progression is pretty well done, even though the game has a very comfortable and laid-back vibe. There's actually always quite a bit going on. Eventually, you'll have a variety of magic at your disposal, and a bunch of interesting items, even a helpful teleporter of sorts that can bring you back to your home to make map travel less troublesome. And also, throughout the journey, you'll be collecting the black items, artifacts Garb will just find as nostalgic as that black claw from the beginning of the game. These black items and the black wind that erase the story of the Island of the Seven Winds are related to the most poignant character in the game. And the character's name is, well, what is that character's name? That's the big question. To not spoil too much, the character's name is something important. Do you recall how earlier I said a theme of this game is related to the idea of names? One without a name is forgotten. One who is forgotten does not exist in this world. Just a little something to remember. The story of the Black One slowly builds in the background of the entire game while Garp is doing silly little tasks for silly little villagers. And eventually the Black Wind becomes a full-blown storm that cannot be ignored. And the creation of the Black Wind actually involves Garp's sinful past before he was reborn into his more quaint, cuddly professor form, a past which will be revealed to the player in Garp's dreams as he collects the black items. Throughout the game, there is an eerie undercurrent, especially in the dream sequences, of an unsettling nature that threatens to disrupt the peaceful vibes of the village in a frightening way. It makes for some quite tense moments in the otherwise relaxing game. As for Garp streams, I will not spoil much about them, and this will end my talk about the story of Nanatsu Kaze because Lucian feels it is just a really nice thing to play for oneself. Shima felt quite emotional after it ended, in fact, and I mean, look at him. He's usually such a small stone face. A tiny Buster Keaton, they call him. But as you see here from the footage, the dream sequences in Nanatsu Kaze are quite novel, while the game is a testament to Givro's ability and the Sega Saturn's 2D prowess. The dream sequences make use of Amamiya's filmmaking skills as they are live action and stop motion. In the picture imagination book, Amamiya reflects, as for the live action movie parts, stop motion takes time. Even if we filmed all day, we'd only get about 8 seconds of footage. On average, we got about 5 seconds per day, and that lasted for 40 days, which was the toughest part. The idea was that the live action could be used anywhere. So instead of using it in an exaggerated way in the opening or ending, we decided to use it properly in parts that were directly connected to the game. And that's how the concept of having the 2D Garp's dream be represented in 3D live action came about. Thanks to that, we were able to create something that was closely tied to the story, and I think that's the best part. I'd say the highlight is probably the fact we didn't have to cut corners. It might sound strange, but in this digital age, not relying on digital technology and instead making everything by hand is actually a rather luxurious approach. And in fact, I think luxurious is a really nice way to describe Nanatsu Kaze as a whole, actually. The game itself came in this 2-disc set, where the second disc has a bunch of cool extras. I did not talk about the music yet, mostly because the majority of the game uses diegetic soundscapes to replace typical background music. So, for the majority of your journey, you'll be hearing the soothing songs of insects, the wind whistling through the grass, the rippling water, the clacking stones under your dragon feet, and so forth. It's actually quite calming and fitting, but there are also proper songs as well, and as such the game received an awesome, luxurious, I would say, soundtrack by Buddyzoo, composed by Hirokazu Ota and Shinji Kinoshita, frequent collaborators with Amamiya projects. And the soundtrack has in its liner notes the I guess you call them the storyboards of perhaps the most pivotal moment in the game involving Garp and the mysterious creature related to the Black Wind and the Black Items. Just as the soundtrack does a really cool looking package overall, and also the amount of time and effort that went into the artwork and sprite work for the game is quite crazy, especially at a time period when people were leaving 2D for 3D in droves. Plus, there is the art book for the game, the Picture Imagination book, which is presented in an actual fairy tale storybook format. And it has individually drawn artworks for every character, every background, object, and item. Everything about Nanatsu Kaze really goes beyond the norm. There is just such an extravagance to its very existence. Extravagance and ambition. Early in this video, I talked about how Gibro was always making ambitious games, and Lucian feels that Nanatsu Kaze was their most ambitious title of all, but also the one where they really hit the mark, reached their highest point. They reached for the stars with this one, Amamiya too. Enix as well is to be commended for even allowing such an uncommercial game like Nanatsu Kaze the development time that it needed. I also mentioned Givro games that often deal with evolution or metamorphosis, and Nanatsu Kaze as being one of those type of games. Metamorphosis plays a big part in the story of Garp and the mysterious creature related to the Black Wind. The eggs or cocoons or chrysalis, whatever you wish to call them, such as the one we see Garp hatch out of at the start of the game, are integral aspects to the arrival on the Island of the Seven Winds, and the game's penultimate chapter is a particularly powerful one involving such transformation. And in a way, Gibro as a company really transformed in their own final form with this game. With Nanatsu Kaze, Lucian believes they reached a high level as game developers. And so, naturally, with all that care put into the game, right down to the smallest detail of wind particles and blades of grass, with all that investment in the project, with Amamiya's unique vision, Gibro's dedication, Enix's patience, naturally, the game was a commercial failure. Yeah, surprisingly, right? I don't know the original sources, but I saw on some Japanese websites that only 5,500 copies of the game or so were ever sold on its first day of release. And maybe only 7,000 in total while the game was still in, like, circulation. Well, I can't verify these totals. Those are just numbers I keep seeing come up on various Japanese websites. But even if those are not the actual figures were not very good, basically. We can deduce by that. But I mean, it is not an unexpected outcome. This is just how the world works sometimes. Just because you put an intense amount of effort and care into something, it doesn't mean that other people are going to care or even give it a chance. There is no guarantee there even exists an audience out there for certain things off the beaten path. Some things simply do not have mass appeal. Amamiya knew it from the start, calling his fairy tale style uncommercial in his Fangs art book before Nanatsu Kaze was ever even in development. Enix took a chance. They gambled on Amamiya's unique vision, and in terms of sales, I'm sure the game is considered a failure by many metrics. A couple of Japanese sites seem to mainly blame marketing or the lack thereof, though Nanatsu Kaze does have a really cool commercial.
雨宮啓太監督作品アドベンチャー RPG 七つ風の島物語いよいよ発売風と名前と友達とセガサターン
But even so, Nanatsu Kaze is simply a very niche game. But regardless, Lucian contends that the game being a commercial failure means little in terms of its own quality as an exploration game. Sure, it is not a perfect game. Many people will actually find it painfully slow, especially when Garp turns around each time he gets to the end of a screen to glance back. That is probably the most egregious example of the game's glacial pacing at times. But Nanatsu Kaze is also the type of game that once you get into its rare groove, you may find yourself enjoying the rhythm. As a puzzle game set in an odd world full of even odder inhabitants, whose conversations are translated via a third-party narrator of dubious reliability, there are a few obtuse puzzles, though Lucian contends nothing to the extent of more famous puzzle games that do have mainstream appeal, like those of the classic PC adventure game puzzle era. But generally, Nanatsu Kaze is a very polished game. Actually, a lot of the complaints about the game on certain sections on the internet involved a language barrier. So, as when this video was created, there were no fan translation patches for it, though maybe you're watching this in a bright future where that has changed. Lucian did find one possible glitch that could potentially get you stuck in the game, but he also found a solution, and he would like to recreate that glitch in a future playthrough and make a video on it to show how not to get stuck should that happen to you. But anyways, Lucian is a big fan of the Sega Saturn console and considers Nanatsu Kaze in his top 5 titles for the system. He finds it to be a beautiful example of 2D Saturn sprite work and of top form Amamiya originality. combined with a heartfelt story and quality gameplay. The way the island opens up over time, he finds particularly well done as well. Thus, he kept blabbering about the game to me until I was fed up and helped him make this video. I hope some of you out there stuck around this far. If so, you'd be perfect candidates to play the game. If you make it through Lucian's rambling pacing style, you can handle Nanatsu Kaze no problem, I guarantee you. Compared to Lucian's long-windedness, Nanatsu Kaze is, well, a speedrun. A speedrun like the wind. So, yeah, that is the story of, well, the story of the Island of the Seven Winds. But now, you know all this info about the game's beginnings and its ending. How things ended up in terms of sales, which was not exactly a fairy tale ending, certainly not a happily ever after. What about its epilogue? Despite the apparent commercial failure of the game, Amamiya, even with all his success with his more commercial works, has continued to revisit the characters and the world of the Seven Winds over the years. In the year 2000, Ganapa's Hand was released. This is another Amamiya project done in the same storybook art style as Nanatsu Kaze. Ganapa's Hand is a sort of make-your-own adventure book. That is not an entirely accurate description, but I'm not really sure how to put it. It is a full-color comic book full of Nanatsu Kaze-esque creatures, in which you use scissors to cut and fold and so forth to form and finish the story. It seems Amamiya was still not done with his idea of interactivity a la Peter Pan, and with scissors involved, it's no surprise that this particular project involved Kisuke of Iho Kenbon Roku and Nanatsu Kaze fame. Actually, where Nanatsu Kaze was the origin story of Garp and how he became Professor Garp and ended up on the island of the Seven Winds, so too is Ganapa's Hand the origin story of Kisuke and how he ended up in his own egg and hatched into the island of the Seven Winds. Ganapa's Hand is quite a fascinating work of art in itself, and if anybody is interested, Lucian and I can make a video focusing on it. Let us know in the comments if that sounds like something you'd want to hear about. Since 2000, Amamiya has made other references to the Natsukaze characters here and there in his various works, but one particularly noteworthy reappearance of the island occurred in 2024, when an art exhibit was held at Space Kaiman in Tokyo, with Nanatsu Kaze and Iho Kenboroku on display. Space Kaiman, for your interest, is basically just a art exhibit kind of showcase type of place, which is pretty surprising, honestly, that Nanatsu Kaze was featured in such a place. But it is no surprise if you've seen Amamiya's art, because it is honestly pretty museum worthy. Also, of note, Amamiya is apparently during 2022 or so, the lockdown era, he became a big fan of Animal Crossing. So, yeah. As for Gibra, well, sadly, the company ended after Nanatsu Kaze. It was their last game, which is a real shame because it is a game that truly shows Gibro at their best, as professionals and masters of their craft. Even as a small team, they did everything they were asked of by Amamiya and Enix, and the result was pretty awesome. Enix had said, only Gibro can pull this off, and Gibro did pull it off. So it is a shame that we never got to see another Gibro title after Nanatsu Kaze, but at least they went out on top, I suppose. I am sure Nanatsu Kaze's lack of commercial success is what finally killed Gibro, but I don't know if that was the only factor. Gibro had run into trouble, presumably of the financial variety, before, like with their cancelled arcade fighter Burning Street from 1995, but that is a different story for another time. As for Enix, well, they no longer exist. In Enix only form, that is. Enix merged with Square in 2003, and the two companies become one, the imaginatively named Square Enix. Pretty creative, right? Don't worry, everyone. They continue to publish Dragon Quest titles in case you were wondering. As a side note, later it was revealed by at least two Sega employees, one being Yumiko Miyabe, the art director of Space Channel 5, that Sega actually created a top secret Dragon Quest demo that they showed to Enix in hopes that Enix would develop a Dragon Quest title for the Saturn. But Enix did not pursue that project. You may be wondering, how is that character from the Sega Saturn faring these days? The speedy and sharp blue hedgehog? Well, Kisuke the blue hedgehog tailor is doing just fine. Thank you very much. In fact, in the year 2024, some official Kisuke merchandise was released. Check it out! It's a Kisuke Sofubi from T-Base, Japan. But what about Professor Garp? Is he doing okay? Does he still have writer's block? Or is he taking care of himself in his comfy chair with his blanket held close when the cold winds blow? Or has he finally been forgotten by time? Let's let Amamiya answer that himself in Nanatsu Kaze no Shima Monogatari's own in-game epilogue chapter. In this chapter, which occurs after the ending of the game, basically it is just the post-game where you can continue to fish and hang out with villagers and so on. There's a sort of hidden message from Amamiya, and you can find involving the Growl dragon, a creature in the game that represents something Nanatsu Kaze has in abundance: imagination. The Growl dragon is a fragment of imagination. When someone thinks of something, when someone has a thought, the Growl dragon bursts forth and takes shape. It could be a living creature or a song. Everything is what we have thought. The Growl dragon will never disappear. Thinking, feeling, it is always here, as many as the number of thoughts. When you think of Garp, when you think of Kisuke, they are always here, on the island of the Seven Winds. Despite its low sales, Nanatsu Kaze has a few but faithful following, and as long as those few remember the name of Garp and a certain important friend related to the Black Wind, then all the hard work by the company that once went by another unique name, the name being Kipro, was not for nothing. And Lucian hopes this video helps crawl some of these important names into a few fluff-filled heads like fuzzy little brainworms, so that Garp and all the inhabitants of the Seven Winds Island will be just fine as long as there is even one person out there that still remembers the name of the game. Nanatsu Kaze no Shima Monogatari.